Being part of the LGBTQIA+ community is challenging enough anywhere in the world. Every day, people from this community face prejudice, humiliation, and even violence. According to ILGA World, an international organization that fights for LGBTQIA+ rights in over 150 countries, hate crimes against this community can represent 10 to 30% of all hate crimes recorded in places with monitoring systems. These figures are shocking and expose the harsh reality experienced by so many people. Have you ever thought about what it's like to be a trans person in a Muslim-majority country? The image that comes to mind is usually one of repression, prejudice, and very little freedom, right? Now imagine living like that for centuries, facing not only strict laws and social exclusion, but also abuse and violence that defy any notion of human dignity. Against this cruel backdrop come the hijras, known as the world's first Muslim transgender community. But how do they resist? How do they keep their identity alive in the face of so many challenges? Get ready, because today Bello Mundo is going to take you to discover facts that will challenge everything you thought you knew about faith, culture, and human resistance. To understand exactly why the hijras are so special, it is essential to understand the context in which they live. In most countries where Sharia, Islamic law, is interpreted very restrictively, being LGBTQIA+ can result in severe penalties, ranging from a fine to death, depending on the place. And if homosexuality is already frowned upon, the situation of trans people is often even more complicated. It's as if, for the more conservative wings, questioning gender binarism is something that clashes not only with society's morals, but also with religion. The worst thing is that prejudice comes not only from the state, but also from families, communities, and religious leaders. Have you ever thought about growing up in a home where the father himself considers it a sin for his son to want to dress in women's clothes? Or having to face a crowd in the mosque, whispering, pointing fingers, saying that someone is immoral just for existing? For many people, this is real life. And that's when the stories of expulsion from home, conversion therapies, and even physical violence disguised as correction emerge. In this scenario, gays, lesbians, and trans people often find themselves isolated, without support, and in a climate of constant fear. Have you ever heard of corrective sexual violence? For those who have never heard of it, it's something that really shocks. It's a practice in which a lesbian woman is forced into sexual intercourse with the sick aim of reorienting her. And what about trans people? Often pushed into prostitution without the right to formal employment, without minimally decent health care, they end up suffering a veritable festival of human rights violations. And yet, it is in this very context that hijras have resisted for centuries, defying prejudice and finding ways to protect themselves. This is precisely why their story attracts so much attention. Number 1. Who are the hijras? Now that we have a general idea of how difficult it is to be LGBTQIA+ in many Muslim environments, it's time to get straight to the point. Who are the hijras? The term hijra comes from Hindustan, a region that encompasses parts of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. For a long time, Westerners have translated this word as eunuch or hermaphrodite, but these translations are very limited, as they don't cover all the variety of expressions and identities present in this group. In more up-to-date terms, we can say that hijra is a community formed by people who identify themselves outside of the standard male or female. They can be transvestites, trans women, intersexuals, or even individuals who identify as neither male nor female, and who challenge the norms of masculinity or femininity in such a striking way that they organize themselves into a third gender. In Pakistan and Bangladesh, for example, many people describe hijras as a female mind in a male body. But make no mistake, this phrase is only a rough sketch of reality. In practice, each hijra has their own life story, their own way of looking at the Islamic faith, and their own experiences, which can involve rejection, acceptance, traditional rights. It's a whole world that goes beyond any simple definition. What is common, however, is that they organize themselves into communities or houses, headed by a guru or mother. These veteran figures guide the newcomers, defend them when necessary, and impose rules of coexistence that help maintain the group's cohesion. Number 2. History. Would you believe that in some historical periods, hijras enjoyed a certain prestige? Yes, this may seem shocking to those who observe how they are treated today, but during the Mughal Empire, from the 16th to the 19th century, certain hijras held prominent positions in the courts, acting as guardians of the harems or even as confidants of the nobility. Why were they tolerated and even valued? Partly because they posed no sexual risk to the harems, but also because of the mystical aura that surrounded them, something to do with fertility rituals and good luck. At the time, many people believed that the blessing of a hijra could bring prosperity or guarantee the health of newborn babies. There were also artistic performances at weddings or parties where the presence of hijras was seen as a sign of good luck. Of course, not everything was a bed of roses, but compared to today, life could be much less oppressive. There are even reports of hijras who achieved positions of relative influence, offering political advice or ensuring the safety of rulers' wives. Unfortunately, this privileged status fell apart with the arrival of British colonialism. The British, with all their Victorian morals, created laws that classified hijras as undesirable or criminals. And this, of course, gave rise to persecution and a whole series of stigmas that remain to this day. And we'll talk more about that next. Number 3. The clash with colonialism. Remember when we talked about how hijras had a place in society before the British arrived? Well, they took part in rituals, had influence in royal courts, and were valued in various cultural contexts. But when colonialism came knocking, all this began to crumble. The British brought with them a binary and conservative vision. In their minds, there were only two possible genders, man or woman. Any identity that didn't fit into this idea was branded as perverse or abnormal. And it didn't stop there. They created laws to support this view. One example is the Criminal Tribes Act. This law labeled entire tribes as prone to crime, and guess what? The hijras were included in this group. That was a watershed. From then on, the community was no longer seen as respectable and was treated as a threat to public order. What was once reverence became stigma. From being mystical and respected figures, they became marginalized. Now, here's the part that surprises a lot of people. Prejudice didn't end with the end of colonialism. When India and Pakistan gained independence, and later with the emergence of Bangladesh, the same stigmas created by the British continued. Instead of inclusion, post-colonial governments reinforced exclusion. Hijras were treated as a national disgrace, and public policies only increased repression. For those who were born in Pakistan or Bangladesh and identified as hijra, life became even more difficult. As well as dealing with strict religious norms, they were seen as criminals just for existing. The result? Complete marginalization. Many ended up in prostitution, on the streets, or performing clandestinely at parties where they were both exploited and disapproved of by society. Number 4. Harsh realities, current discrimination. In many countries, they continue to live on the margins without access to basic rights such as health or education. Think of the following situation. A person who needs sex reassignment surgery or even medical attention to take hormones faces huge barriers in the public system. And if someone identifies as a hijra when they arrive at a hospital, they can prepare themselves for looks of suspicion, disregard, and often no help at all. In the religious field, things aren't easy either. In more conservative mosques, the presence of trans people is seen as an affront, and reports of hijras being expelled or humiliated are common. For this reason, many don't even try to go there to avoid the pain of being rejected. And inside the home, things can be even more painful. In many families, the subject is ignored, treated as shameful. The solution? Unfortunately, it is common for trans children to be thrown out of the house or forced to change who they are. With family and society on their backs, the job market also closes its doors. And what's left? For many hijras, survival means joining small groups and looking for alternative means of support, begging for money on the streets, dancing at parties, or often resorting to prostitution as a last option. The worst part is when these people try to seek justice. Reporting cases of violence or transphobia often turns into another trauma. There are stories of police officers refusing to register incidents and judges minimizing aggressions that are clearly motivated by prejudice. This reality is more than painful. It is proof of how the system fails to protect the most vulnerable. Number 5. Hope in Indonesia. If everything seems bleak so far, calm down. There are stories that show that even in the most difficult scenarios, hope can flourish. And for that, let's take a trip to Indonesia, the world's largest Muslim country in terms of population, where a heartwarming initiative was born. We're talking about the Al-Fatah Islamic Center in Yogyakarta. This incredible space was created especially for trans women and, by extension, hijras who may migrate there. And the most impressive thing, not only do they gather there, but they also pray and study the Quran in a safe and judgment-free environment. Yes, you read that right. A place where Islamic faith and trans identity coexist in harmony. Al-Fatah's proposal is as simple as it is powerful: to create a refuge for those who would normally be shunned from traditional mosques. There they can pray, learn about religion, and take part in social activities. It's as if the center is saying, yes, it's possible to be Muslim and trans at the same time. But of course, not everyone applauds this initiative. Conservative groups have already tried to close down Al-Fatah and accused its founders of misrepresenting Islam. So far, however, they have stood their ground. What makes this project even more inspiring is that it breaks the discourse that Islam does not accept transgenderism. On the contrary, it shows that there are more inclusive interpretations, religious leaders who are open to diversity, and a vision that compassion and divine justice, the core values of the Quran, do not exclude anyone from prayer. Number 6. Bangladesh Mosque for Hijras. Would you like some more hope-renewing news? In Bangladesh, a country with one of the largest hijra communities in the world, something incredible happened. In 2024, the first inclusive mosque for transgender people was inaugurated. That's right, a space designed to welcome those who have always been rejected by traditional mosques. Behind this initiative is the cleric Mufti Abdul Rahman Azad, who uttered an impactful phrase: "God's house belongs to everyone. No one can be denied." And that opened the door, literally, to donations, volunteers, and a movement that turned the project into reality. As well as being a place of faith, this mosque is also a support center where lectures, social activities, and even discussions about health take place, something crucial for such a vulnerable community. For many hijras who had previously avoided mosques for fear of humiliation, this space represents dignity and belonging. Of course, as was the case in Indonesia, this idea was not and is not being well received by everyone. The usual ones, the conservative groups, soon came out with accusations that the initiative was misrepresenting religion. Nevertheless, the project is still going strong, proving that faith and inclusion don't have to be opposites. Number 7. Backlash in Malaysia. While countries like Bangladesh and Indonesia are beginning to take courageous steps to include the trans community, Malaysia reminds us that things don't always move forward. Sometimes they move backwards. About 30 years ago, Malaysia was seen as a relatively tolerant place. But since then, increasingly conservative policies and a rigid view of Islam have changed everything, creating a stifling environment for those who deviate from traditional gender norms. Today, wearing what reflects your identity can be grounds for fines, imprisonment, or both. Places where trans women used to find work, such as beauty salons or bars, are now constant targets for police raids. Think of the impact of living in fear of simply going out on the street. This oppression not only generates exclusion, but also worrying figures for violence. This change didn't come naturally. It has been pushed through by policies that claim to protect morality, but in practice only perpetuate prejudice. Basic rights? Almost non-existent for this community. Despite this, all is not lost. Groups of lawyers and activists are taking these laws to court, arguing that they violate constitutional principles. And in the midst of so much conservatism, some progressive religious leaders are beginning to question whether it really makes sense to exclude and oppress people when values such as compassion and mercy are central to Islam. It's an uphill struggle, but this resistance keeps the hope of better days alive. Number 8. The Scriptures. And to close on a high note, here's a possible plot twist that could change the way you look at all this. Did you know that there is evidence that the Prophet Muhammad himself defended those who were different? Yes, this information, recorded in historical passages, may surprise many people. Let's talk about the term mukhanathun. It appears in ancient texts to describe people with feminine traits or behaviors, something that today can be associated with trans experiences. And here comes the most interesting detail. There are reports that Muhammad protected a mukhanathun in a moment of danger, guaranteeing his safety from the violence of others. Of course, this idea is controversial. Some argue that these passages are legitimate and show a more inclusive side of Islam. Others, more conservative, question their authenticity or diminish their relevance. But the main point is this: if these stories are taken seriously, the exclusion of trans people or people outside the gender binary would not be something divine, but the result of cultural constructions. This would open up space for a much more welcoming rereading of Islam. And it makes sense, doesn't it? After all, Islam teaches that God knows and values all the diversity that He Himself created. Compassion, rahmah, is a central tenet of the faith. So why not extend it to everyone? Progressive leaders, as we have seen in Indonesia and Bangladesh, are already embracing this idea, arguing that the scriptures can and should be reinterpreted in a more inclusive way. This debate is far from a consensus, but the fact that it exists already shows that Islam is more complex and full of nuances than many imagine. And perhaps it is precisely in this discussion that changes are beginning to gain momentum. What do you think of everything we've seen about the hijras? Was there any part that surprised or shocked you the most, be it the way they live or the difficulties they face? Could you imagine yourself in such a marginalized reality? Leave your opinion here in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any content that explores our Bello Mundo, which is often not so bello. Thank you very much for watching and see you next time.